Chapter 8. Clara's preparations for Christmas were in full swing. Albert had told her about inviting one of his friends for Christmas dinner, and he'd brought her a turkey, which she'd prepared to cook on Christmas morning. She found that she had a little less energy every day, and her stomach always seemed to be rioting against her. She was in her bedroom wrapping the gifts when she realized what must be wrong. She hadn't had her flow since October, and it was now Christmas. Why hadn't she seen it sooner? She was carrying his baby. She didn't even know if Albert wanted another child. They already had enough mouths to feed. She worried but decided she wasn't going to put off telling him. She'd heard tell of a lot of women who would wait for a special occasion to announce their pregnancy, but she'd tell him that night. The next day was Christmas Eve, and he'd work then. On Christmas, they'd go to church in the morning, and have their Christmas dinner shortly after church. She wanted telling him out of the way, before their festivities. After the children were in bed that evening, she put her hand on her stomach, thinking about what it would be like to have a baby around the house. She knew both girls would enjoy having a younger sibling. Natalie had really come around and loved being there. Clarence had loved Montana from the minute he'd gotten off the train. She walked down the stairs quickly, holding her hand to her belly as she did. She saw him sitting quietly at the table, carving something small. "Is that another Christmas gift?" she asked. "No. I'm just messing around." He set the wood down and smiled at her. "You happy?" She nodded. "I'm really excited to see the children's faces on Christmas morning. They'll be thrilled." "They will." His hand reached up to stroke her cheek. "I'm so glad you and the children came out here. You were just what we needed in our lives. How would you feel about more children? If they happened to come along?" she asked. He looked at her surprised. "I hadn't really thought about it. You didn't have children for so long that I figured you were past that." She shrugged. "I thought so too." She looked down at her hands. "I guess not." "You mean?" His eyes were wide as he stared at her. "Yes, we're expecting. Probably about July." She bit her lip, worried that he would be unhappy with her condition. His face lit up in a grin. "I think that's exactly what we need. We have your kids and my kids, but we need one that's ours, too." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her softly. "I love the idea. I wasn't sure how you'd feel. I didn't think I could have more children, just because I hadn't, and I had symptoms for a while, but never really connected it." She rested her hand against his cheek, thrilled that he wasn't angry with her. "I'm glad you're happy about the baby. There's no reason to ever be sad about a baby. If all of ours were under 5, and you had another coming, that would be hard, but it would still be a blessing. I love children." She nodded. "I do too." "So when should we tell the children?" he asked. "Why don't we tell them at breakfast in the morning? I'd love to start making tiny little blankets and clothes tomorrow. They'll be hard to explain if the children don't know about the baby." He chuckled. "That would be hard to explain." He shook his head. "I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around this. We're really having a baby." Clara couldn't believe the joy in his face as they talked about the child. "Do you know where the closest midwife is?" "The one Sally used is just a couple of miles up the road." "You'll be fine." She sighed and nodded. "I admit, my biggest fear about moving here was how far we'd be from the nearest town. I wasn't sure I'd feel safe without having a doctor I could run to. Well, if it comes to it, I'm sure I could help. I've helped the horses and cows give birth on several occasions." She made a face. "I'm sure you're qualified, but not so sure how I'd feel about it. I'd rather you didn't see me that way." He grinned. "Sally said the same thing. It's not like I've never seen you before." She blushed. Maybe you have seen me, but you haven't seen a baby coming out of me, and you're just not going to. She leaned back in her chair and folded her arms across her chest. He laughed softly. Whatever you want. I'm just glad we're having a baby. I was worried you wouldn't want it. That you'd think we had enough mouths to feed. Not at all. I mean, I don't want to feed more mouths, but I'm thrilled we're having another child. We make enough. We'll be fine. She rested her hand on his knee. I'm glad. Have you been sick a lot? She nodded. Mainly in the mornings, but it happens in the middle of the afternoon too. It started the morning that you weren't here because you were driving Mary. I thought it was just nerves because I was worried about you. She shrugged with a smile. I guess not. He stood and took her hand, leading her to the bedroom. I'm happy for the baby. I hope the pregnancy is easy for you. The others were. Of course, I was much younger then. It's not like you're ancient now. Why, we could easily have another 4 or 5 children. He quickly undressed and readied himself for bed, climbing in and watching her undress. His eyes watched her carefully, as if he was trying to see every little change in her body. You don't look pregnant. She laughed as she pulled a nightgown over her head. You say that as if it's a bad thing. I would think that would thrill you. He shrugged. It never bothered me when Sally became huge with child, and I'm sure it won't bother me when you do either. It's my child changing your body. She climbed into bed beside him and snuggled into his arms. She knew she should probably be disappointed that he didn't love her, but she was just thrilled that he wasn't unhappy about the baby. I can't wait to tell the children. Natalie and Gertie are going to be really excited. His hand stroked her. I guess it's a good thing the girls moved into a bedroom together. Now there will be room for the baby. Clara sighed happily. There will be. And we won't have to do it later. He cupped her cheek and turned her face up to his. Thank you for giving me a child. She rubbed her cheek against his chest, content. He stroked her back and reached over to turn down the lantern and plunged them into darkness. Kissing the top of her head, he whispered, "Good night." She was already sleeping. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Clara made breakfast the following morning, very excited that they would be telling the children about the baby at breakfast. Once they were all seated, and Albert had said the prayer, she said, "Papa, and I have something to tell all of you." The children looked at each other. Please tell me Aunt Mary isn't coming back. Natalie blurted out. Clara laughed. No, Aunt Mary is not coming back. She smiled at her daughter, and then her eyes moved between the children. You tell them, Albert. We're having another baby, he said, his face spread into a wide grin. Natalie looked between the two of them. Are you serious? That's your news? Clara nodded. Not what you expected, she asked. Natalie shook her head adamantly, an angry look on her face. Gertie jumped up and ran to hug Clara. I want a sister. Albert smiled. We can't control whether the baby is a boy or a girl. We'll feel blessed with either. Clarence didn't comment, but he didn't look upset by the news either. Robert smiled. I won't be the youngest anymore? You won't be the youngest. Does that make you happy? Clara asked. Robert frowned. I don't know. Do I have to share my train? Yes, you do, Clara told him. You'll have to share all of your toys, whether it's a girl or a boy. Robert gave a long-suffering sigh. I suppose I can put up with that, so I won't have to be the youngest anymore. Can I help you change diapers, Mama? Gertie asked. That's a duty I'm happy to share. Clara kept her gaze on her older daughter, wondering what was going through her mind. She'd have to be sure to get her aside and talk to her sometime that day. Albert pushed back from the table. "Thank you for the fine breakfast, Clara." Clara nodded at him, glad he'd started to come around and compliment each of the meals she fixed. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." Albert and Clarence put on their winter coats and left. Clara looked at Robert. "I want you to play quietly for a moment. Gertie, would you clear the table and get started on washing the dishes while Natalie and I make the beds? I know it's not how we usually do things, but just for today, would you mind?" Gertie shook her head, eager to please as always. Clara climbed the stairs behind Natalie, wondering what was going on. She was worried about the cold reception their news had gotten from Natalie, because she was usually so excited about children. When they reached the girls' room, they each went to opposite sides of the bed to make it. "What's wrong, Natalie? Aren't you happy about the baby?" Natalie shrugged. "I like babies." "What's wrong then?" "I don't understand why you're not happier." Clara plumped the pillow and rested it back onto the bed. "I feel like you like Gertie and Robert more than me already. If you have another baby, you'll never have time for me." Natalie blurted the words out, looking very upset. Clara sighed. "How could I like anyone better than my firstborn daughter?" She sat on the bed and patted the spot next to her. "The others are younger and need my attention more. I have to give them more of my time. With this baby coming, I'm going to need your time. Expecting a baby makes a woman a lot more tired than usual. Cooking breakfast in the mornings is making me sick to my stomach. I may need you to do some of those things for me." She gave Natalie a quick hug. "I'm so proud of the young woman you've become." Tears sprang into Natalie's eyes. "I'll help as much as I can, Mama. And I want to help change diapers too." Clara laughed. "I promise there will be enough diapers for all of us to take our turns." Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Natalie was up earlier than usual the following morning, which was Christmas. She helped Clara get the turkey ready for the oven, and then she suggested Clara sit down while she cooked. Clara smiled at her daughter. "I'm going to go wake everyone and help the two little ones get ready for church. Thank you for being such a good daughter to me." Albert was already outside milking the cows and collecting eggs. He was startled to see Natalie at the stove instead of Clara. "Is your mama sick?" Natalie shook her head as she carefully turned the bacon. "She told me yesterday that cooking breakfast is making her sick to her stomach, so I did it for her." She shrugged as if cooking breakfast for the family was something she did every day. Albert smiled, giving her a one-armed hug. Natalie had always been standoffish toward him, and he didn't feel like he was getting a chance to get to know her at all. "Your mama, and I appreciate all the hard work you do around here. You're a good daughter." Natalie looked at him with surprise. "Thank you, Papa." He turned away and grinned as he went into the bedroom to put on his church clothes. It was the first time Natalie had called him Papa, and it felt good to him. He put on his clothes and joined the family at the table. Both boys were in their suits, and Gertie was in one of the pretty dresses Clara had made for her. Last Christmas had been terrible, with his wife being so ill, and the children so sad. He was glad God had blessed them so much in the past year, and he smiled at Clara. She was a beautiful woman and a good wife. He didn't know when he'd come to love her, but he hadn't been able to stop himself. She was the wife he needed. The children loved her, and the fact that she was carrying his child was just icing on the cake. After breakfast, they opened their gifts one by one. They had Robert go first, because he was the youngest, and he was thrilled with his new hat and gloves. He tried the gloves on and clapped his hands together with excitement. He squealed with excitement when he saw the train. "Oh, thank you, Papa." His sisters had worked together to make him a new quilt for his bed. He immediately covered up with it, his eyes wide with surprise. "Thank you." Gertie went next, exclaiming over her new sweater and the figurines her papa had made her. Natalie and Clarence had worked together, and Clarence had built a small doll bed, while Natalie had made a doll-sized quilt for it. Gertie hugged everyone, thanking them over and over for the wonderful gifts. Clarence was thrilled with the new coat, hat, and gloves his mother had made him. The toolbox Albert fashioned made his eyes light up with excitement. Albert had even purchased him a hammer and saw of his very own. The girls had made him a pair of socks. "I've never had a better Christmas," he exclaimed. Natalie smiled happily when she opened the sweater that matched Gertie's. "Now we can look alike at church today." She loved her new doll bed, and laughed that she'd been made the same thing as Gertie had. Gertie had made her a pillow for their bed, because she always said one wasn't enough. Clarence had given her a small book of poems he'd seen in the mercantile. When it was Clara's turn to open her gifts, she smiled looking at them. "I really didn't expect anything." Albert shook his head. "After all the trouble you went to for everyone else, there was no way I was going to let you go without a gift yourself." The girls had given her a doily for her dresser that they'd crocheted the lace for. She smiled as she looked at their imperfect stitches and knew she'd treasure it all the more for them. Clarence gave her his gift next. It was a small glass squirrel. She'd always loved to watch squirrels, and when Clarence was little, she'd made up stories about squirrels for him. When Albert handed her his gift, her heart skipped a beat. She carefully opened the brown wrapping paper and peeked inside. She put her hand to her chest and exclaimed happily when she saw what it was. "Oh, thank you." It was just like the brooch she'd had to sell right before they'd left Beckham. She'd always regretted doing it, but she'd had no choice. "It's exactly like the one I sold." "I'm glad," Albert told her. His eyes on hers let her know that he cared, more than just a little bit for her. Clara pinned the brooch at the neck of her blouse, wishing she had a small mirror so she could see how it looked. She stood and walked around the table, kissing Albert's cheek. "It's lovely." He smiled at her. "It looks as beautiful on you as I'd envisioned." She flushed. She hadn't expected praise for her appearance from him. "Thank you." She moved back around to sit in the spot she'd occupied previously, thrilled that he had given her the compliment. The children each gave him a gift. The girls had worked together to make him a scarf, taking turns knitting between chores. Clarence had sharpened his saw carefully for him one day when he was left at home. "I noticed it was rusty and gave it a good cleaning and sharpened it for you. I didn't know what else you needed." Albert had smiled at him. This was the perfect gift. "I thought I was going to have to do it myself within the next week or so, and I wasn't looking forward to missing out on work." "Thank you, son." Clarence had beamed with pride. "You're welcome, Pa." Clara took the package she'd wrapped and pushed it across the table to Albert. He carefully untied the string and looked down at what was inside. A smile transformed his face. He looked at the stocking cap and pulled the gloves onto his hands. "These will be wonderful this winter." "Thank you." Clara grinned and pushed the smaller package at him. "You're welcome." "What's this?" "You already gave me a gift." "I made you a couple of gifts, but I wanted to buy you something special as well." She shrugged like it didn't matter. He opened the gift and turned the knife over in his hand. "I thought it would be good for your whittling." "The one you have has a nick in the blade," she told him. Albert shook his head. "This is beautiful. I don't need anything nearly this fancy." He smiled as his finger traced the cowboy on the handle. "I thought it would make it more special when you made something if you carved it with that." "I love it." He stared down at it resting in the palm of his hand. "I've never seen anything like it." "Thank you." He'd never been given anything nearly so grand. His new wife thought of everything. He had loved his first wife, but she was right. He could love one and then love another after she was gone. He needed to tell her. Clara jumped to her feet. We need to go if we don't want to be late for church. Is everyone ready? Natalie was the only one not dressed in church clothes. She'd been afraid to get them dirty as she cooked breakfast. It'll just take me a minute to change, Mama. The next few minutes were frantic as they rushed out the door. Albert and Clarence went out to hitch up the sleigh, and Clara helped the two younger children into their coats, hats, and mittens. The ride to church was enjoyable. They sang Christmas songs as they drove. It was Clara's first time at the church in town, and she met so many people, she felt as if her head would spin. She stiffened up when she saw Mary with her new husband. She tried to turn away, but Mary hurried to her. Please let me come back to live in your house. I'll help with every chore and never behave badly again. Clara looked at the other woman, not sure of what to say. She didn't want to see anyone suffer, but she certainly didn't want to have to be saddled with the harridan ever again. Albert stepped up behind her and came to her rescue. You're married now. You'll go home with your husband. Frank stepped up behind Mary. You complaining about me, wife? Mary quickly shook her head. Of course not. Frank shrugged. She sure complains a lot to others about how terrible of a husband I am, but she doesn't complain in bed at night. He waggled his brows at Albert. I think it's time for us to go, Albert said, slipping his arm around Clara's waist and gathering the children. I'm sure we'll see you around town. When they arrived home, Clara and the girls rushed around to get Christmas dinner ready. Eli was the first real guest she'd serve in her new home, so Clara wanted everything to be perfect. When Eli arrived, she gave him the foot of the table while she sat at Albert's right. Albert said a prayer, thanking God for his bounty, and they ate together. Eli turned to Clara. I've heard good things about you. How do you like Montana? Clara smiled. I think it's a beautiful place. Do you think it will be a state soon? Just a matter of time. Any other women like you back east who want to come out here and marry? I could use a mail-order bride myself if she's as sweet and pretty as you are. He took a bite of food. And as good a cook. I need a mail-order bride who's a good cook. Clara laughed. I'm sure they could find someone for you. Before you go, I'll give you the address of the agency I used. She smiled at Albert, who shook his head. You never know who you'll end up with when you use an agency to find a bride. Albert shrugged. If you're willing to take the risk, we'll help you find someone. Eli nodded. I want that address. The feast she'd prepared was devoured quickly, and they all sat around for a while after the dishes were done, talking. Clara worked on a tiny sweater while they men compared ranch stories. Eli left before it was full dark. I've been gone too long already, he told Albert. Thank you for inviting me. I haven't spent Christmas with anyone but my dog in years. Clara stood. We're glad you came. Write a letter to Elizabeth, she said, nodding to the paper in his hand. I'd love to see you have a bride of your own next Christmas. Eli smiled. Thank you for a wonderful meal, Mrs. Hanson. I was the luckiest man around to be invited. He looked at Albert. Well, second luckiest. Someone gets to see your pretty face and eat your cooking every day. Clara blushed, looking down. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Clarence and Albert walked Eli out to his sleigh and did the evening chores before coming back inside. When they came back with the milk, Clara asked, Is anyone hungry yet? Albert patted his stomach. I couldn't eat anything yet. Maybe you could make something simple in a couple of hours. Like eggs? Or pancakes? I don't see any of us wanting another big meal. I'll do that then. The children were all playing together, which was rare in their home. The girls usually tried to work in the evenings, and Clarence was always trying to keep up with his schoolwork. That evening, though, the children were playing with Robert's new train and moving things from one doll bed to the other. They were all laughing and joking together, and Clara loved how well they played. Clara looked at Albert. "We have a lovely family." He smiled, his eyes lighting up. "A year ago, I thought my life was over. My wife was dying, and I really thought I'd never know how to smile again. I thank God every day that He brought you into my life and taught me how to smile again. Thank you for teaching me to love again, Clara." Her eyes met his, misty with unshed tears. "I'm proud to have someone like you to love. I'm happy here, and so are my children." They joined hands across the table as the children continued to play. They both truly felt blessed to have found one another. Epilogue. Clara sat down to put pen to paper. She hadn't written Elizabeth in over a month, and the younger woman had sent a letter asking if everything was well. Albert had brought it back from town when he'd made a supply run the day before. She looked down at the cradle beside the table and rocked it with her foot as she wrote. "Dear Elizabeth, I'm so sorry to have worried you. My life is overflowing with goodness. Little Katie is a good baby and a sound sleeper. She's already sleeping through the night every night. I'll start teaching Robert with his older sisters next month. It's hard to believe that I've been here almost a year already. Time certainly does fly when you're happy. Gertie and Natalie took little Robert out to the garden, and they're all waiting for me. I don't want to take her into the sun with as young as she is, so they've taken over my vegetable garden for me. This winter we're going to have a full cellar to choose from. How are things back home? I hope you're still looking for a bride for Eli. He's a good man and deserves to be happy. I'll try to write more often now that the baby is here and healthy. Yours, Clara." Clara stood and breathed deeply of the late summer air. How could she have doubted that Montana was where she was meant to be?